Hi, and welcome back to Neon Liberalism. One question that we get kind of often here at Liberal Currents is, what is Liberal Currents? Occasionally, you'll see people on the internet who are struggling to understand who we are. You'll see them come out with these phrases. They're like, yeah, Liberal Currents, they're liberals. Um, and I thought this was kind of an interesting phenomenon. What we are is in some level right in the name, um, but on another level is confusing to people. So I thought I would have on our founder and editor in chief, Adam Gurri, to answer the question, what is liberal currents?
No, I agree, and I think like part of that confusion reflects our particular journey. Um, we started out in 2017, which feels like an eternity ago, but essentially we spanned the Trump era for everything except the first primary, um, and we didn't necessarily know what we were doing when we started. All we knew is that we were very against Trump. We very much felt that he was the opposite of everything we wanted America to be, but also in a way represented a going back to everything that had gone wrong in American history previously. It's not like he was a totally new phenomena or something. Um, and that, you know, the story of American liberalism is in many ways the story of gradually overcoming those tendencies, um, with some setbacks, with some reversals, from Reconstruction to the Jim Crow period, for example. Um, but, you know, just being a basic bitch American liberal is the sort of believing that we started out a slave society. That was bad. It was good that we wanted to be a republic and not have kings. It was good that we enfranchised more people than in Europe, but not enough people. It was good that we expanded the franchise. It was good that we abolished slavery. It's good. It was good that we tried to consolidate that victory. It was not so good that we failed. It was good that we defeated Jim Crow, right? Like it was great that we've had a lot of immigration. That's just sort of like your basic, not ideological, not philosophically articulated American liberalism. And that's more or less what we wanted to represent, but give the actual rationale. One of our inspirations, which some might find funny, was Jacobin, actually, Jacobin magazine. What Jacobin did was take a perspective that was taken to be assumed debunked in American politics, especially socialism, and say, create a space for saying, look, there's a serious intellectual tradition here. Um, you don't have to be ashamed of being influenced by it or adhering to it. And here's a place you can go for high quality arguments and analysis from that perspective. Um, the funny thing is that liberalism didn't have that problem specifically, but it's still kind of the payoff was similar in that liberalism was triumphant and everyone kind of assumed its victory. But then as a result, a lot of its assumptions were just sort of left in the state of being assumptions. A lot of the old arguments sort of got rigid and started taking on, more of the status of an invocation than an actual articulated defense or argument. Um, so, you get a moment where Donald Trump can be elected president, even if it's through this quirk of the Electoral College at that time. That still means that tens of millions of people voted for him. Um, and you have to say, okay, we have to actually make a case for this. We can't rest on our laurels. We have to think seriously about this. So at first we're very philosophical, and that sort of reflects the toolkit of the people that started out. Um, but over time we get more and more empirical and social scientific and political. I would say not like we weren't political to begin with. Um, but one thing that we wanted to do in the beginning, Paul Kreider, Jason Brigham, and I, who are the co-founders, um, we all came from sort of a open market liberal perspective before. And one thing we wanted to do was make sure that we were building connections further left than we were at that time. Several of us have drifted further left ourselves, I would say, since then. Um, but we made a real effort at that time to make sure we still had plenty of libertarians who were anti-Trump libertarians, right? For us, we still do to this day. Um, but and centrists and people like that. But we wanted to make sure we weren't leaving out the left because we felt like many left liberal criticisms of Republicans in general throughout our lifetimes had simply been proven to be true through Donald Trump giving up on dog whistling and simply whistling, essentially. Um, so that's part of it. I'd say that part has been more successful than we anticipated. Um, and one part that was always a surprise, and which I think you may not have seen before it was the case, is how trans affirming specifically we've become. Because it's not like we were against that before, we were not. But it wasn't one of our areas of focus, especially in 2017 or 2018 necessarily. Um, but as more and more publications have taken on this tone of either being overtly anti trans, obviously, if they're conservative, or well we need to accept yes people can make their own choices about their gender identity but not in the bathroom, not in sports, not in this that or the other thing where it still means you're regulating their lives pretty strictly. We have not wavered on that at all. So I think there's a few areas like that. We're also very pro, we're very pro Ukraine, and also very pro, a Palestinian state or some peace for Palestinians um, side, which I think is a fairly unusual combination for any publication, right or left. Um, so there's a few things that I think make it difficult for us to categorize, not in terms of like people are standing back and looking at the intellectual tradition of liberalism, conservatism, and socialism and saying which one is it. More like contemporary politics wise, people get confused about where exactly to place us.
Yeah, so there's a lot in there. Speaking like just to take one thing, like as a trans person, I can say Liberal Currents has been a very it's a surprisingly trans space in the community. There are a lot of very regular
It
trans
just
contributors, trans voices in there, which is nice. I
yeah,
personally appreciate that.
no,
But I kind of want to ask you like a bit more about this confusion. Like one thing that's we've had on the masthead for a while is that we're a home for mere liberalism, um, and that I guess that's kind of my question: is what does that mean exactly? What does it mean to be a home for mere liberalism?
yeah. So one of the big influential thinkers for our community, for me specifically, is Jacob Levy, who is a political theorist. Um, and his big book was Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom. The big thesis is there are different conflicting strains of liberal thought. In his approach, the lens he's looking at, the rationalists are the people who essentially say you take a centralized state and you impose liberalism on the country. This includes, by the way, libertarians, not just people that we think of as today liberals, but like classical liberals and libertarians. The idea of imposing property rights uniformly on a country, that is rationalism. That is rationalism, purely. Um, whereas pluralism can actually involve a subsection governments or communities that are fairly leftist. You could have, like in India, a federal unit that is run by an actual communist party or something, right? Like you could, in theory, if you're getting very pluralist. But the idea of pluralism is no, the bigger danger is centralized state power. And so you want to split up power. This is the checks and balances tradition. Which extends beyond like design your central government such that there's decentralized power to some extent, and goes all the way into you actually want decentralized centers of social power, so that they can be buttresses against even local state power. So it's pluralism is the strain of liberalism that emphasizes more mitigation of the dangers of power, whereas rationalism is more about giving the very best in liberalism to everyone uniformly. Um, Jacob Levy himself believes that you need both and that there is no possible way to know what the right balance is anywhere. It's just sort of a tragic condition that you're always tinkering with on the margins. Um, but yeah, so mere liberalism means if you're a rationalist, if you're a pluralist, if you're a libertarian, if you are a very far left liberal, um, we're still a place for you. And we consider you part of an internal conversation, not arguments among enemies, so to speak. So part of the mission really is to say to some people who are very hostile to libertarians, of a certain kind, by the way. So hostile to like libertarians who are definitely going to be anti-Trump and pro-racial equality and things like that. But very anti-libertarians because they're against deregulation of any kind and they think it's just a grift on behalf of billionaires. Um, and take libertarians who are very skeptical of anyone who is pro-regulation or pro-state power in any way, and say to them, "You are both liberals. You both have valuable perspectives, and we want you to see each other, if possible, as part of the same community." Um, so that's part of what I think makes us difficult to place. I actually didn't even know, so we rewrote our about page, which was part of the reason we're having this conversation. And I even in rewriting it, I hadn't noticed that one of the things we listed was markets on there. Um, so like when we edited it, someone said, "Oh, is this more like now you're more open to liberal socialism or something because of Matt McManus?" It's like, no, we published him for years. We were already open to him.
Yeah, so that kind of brings me to my other question, I guess the same question phrased differently, which is what's out of bounds, right? What's the most reasonable thing on the left that's out of bounds? And what's the most reasonable thing on the right that's out of bounds?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an easy answer for that, because it's sort of like people bring the case to us, and we think like, is this really something we want to, be publishing? Um, and I mean, if so, if someone actually wanted outright state ownership of industry on a large scale, something like that, that would probably be beyond what I don't know. That's not. That seems to go pretty far towards just socialism, not necessarily liberalism. On the other hand, I have become over the course of doing liberal currents quite open to state management of particular industries, depending on what they are. I personally like the energy industry, including actual like getting fossil fuels and things like that. I've become fairly persuaded that governments may be better, both better at it in terms of like how we would want to be going about that, but also less bad actors than the companies that then become invested in us continuing to rely on oil and things like that. Obviously, in all cases, there are failure modes. So right now, I think oil companies are pretty bad actors in our politics. On the other hand, we know what petrostates are like, and it's not great. On the third hand, Norway is pretty great. So it's there's a right, like it's not, there's a lot of contingency involved, and because of that contingency, that does give us space to say there's a lot of arguments in that field that we would be open to. So it is kind of difficult for me to say. I do think if someone came to us with takes, well, I don't just think, I know. If someone came to us with takes that was trying to argue the moderate side of trans rights, especially now, those are going to get rejected. I'm sorry. Um, I can't think of a time when I would have published it because it's sort of like what are the stakes? I don't, it's kind of like what I've said about immigration, which is even if you believe in enforcing immigration law just because you believe in rule of law, that doesn't necessarily mean we need to justify having the level of surveillance and like people breaking into homes and doing worksite raids and things in order to enforce it. Because what are the stakes if we fail to enforce it, right? Like you can do normal investigative police work and get warrants and things and arrest people without being kind of fascist and intrusive. Similarly, I would say to the trans stuff, let's say one believed the most moderate version of some of these arguments. Who cares? What if they're right and we're wrong on that? Who cares? What exactly is going to be harmed? It's so I can't imagine publishing that even in the best of times, because again, the if they are wrong, then you are denying people their rights. But if they are right, then who cares? So I can't imagine. But especially now when trans rights are actively under attack across the country, no, absolutely not, never.
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting answer. An interesting answer, right? Because okay, we're going to say on the left, Stalinism is out. We're not going to go out here simping for dictators and authoritarians around the world just because they put a red star next to their names. We're not going to do any of that. But we're going to entertain debates about how, the level of government intervention in the economy. We're going to entertain debates about state ownership of the means of production in at least some cases. These are all live questions. Okay. Um, but is there anything on the right where you would say, or like the right, the more conservative end of the spectrum, where you'd like, yeah, there's a live question there. There's a debate that we want to have, and trans rights isn't that, which again I'm pretty happy about. To put down a pretty firm conclusion there. But are there areas where you think there's more of a debate?
Well, I feel like you personally have written a couple of things that have made this move usefully. Of course, that's a liberal appropriating a question that is raised by conservatives more than anything, not their arguments. But you've written about declining birth rates and things like that, and like what that says about modern society. Um, uh, that sometimes even the worst people can focus on a topic that's worth addressing, just maybe not from the same angle that they would. When you had Stephen Waldman on, he also was saying, the Trump administration's approach to trade is insane, but trade imbalances are bad, and they have been a problem for a long time. Of course, the fact that conservatives think that now doesn't actually make it a conservative thing, because for the longest time that was a left thing to point that out. But I think that's another example of just because Trump is saying it or just because a conservative is saying it doesn't mean that the problem doesn't exist. It might not be exactly as they understand it, um, but maybe that's a little bit of a cop out. Are there specific arguments advanced by conservatives that we would publish or find interesting? I mean, so for example, we published someone talking about anti-institutionalism, and he Trzynski, yeah, he
Yeah,
he
Robert Kaczynski.
Robert, yeah. um, I wouldn't call him a conservative exactly. I think he is more libertarian, but a little right-ish libertarian in some respects. And his argument was conservative in the sense of institutionalist, which I mean, on the other hand, I think we all are, at liberal currents for the most part. Um, but he was saying that anti-institutionalism has always been corrosive. It has traditionally in America been more of a leftist thing, at least in like popular discourse. But conservative anti-institutionalism has reached a stage of sort of like nihilism and runaway that's pretty destructive, obviously. Um, that's a conservative-ish argument. Of course, I have been accused by a friend of mine who identifies as a conservative, and has written for us before, in fact, about conservatism. Brandon Turner. Um, he he said when I write about liberal democracy, he argues that I am arguing for conserving our liberal democratic institutions, which I mean, it's not wrong, but again, feels like a bit of a cop out for what you're actually asking. Um,
I don't think it's a cop out actually. Right. I mean, I think for a long time, I grew up with this idea that, like, oh yeah, conservative means we want to conserve the institutions or the practices or the traditions that we have, um, and like Robert has said, like that seems to have gone the way of the dodo on, on the MAGA right. But sure, it's from an intellectual perspective, it's part of the conservative tradition of thought. And yeah, we're willing to entertain some of those arguments. So okay. No, I mean I think that is all interesting. I think to kind of turn this back around to this question of like economic control, seizing the means of production. Um, you were talking about being brought around on this because you think, oh well, the state's better at it. There's like, and this brings us back to some of the classical liberal arguments about, oh, there are certain kinds of natural monopolies that have certain kinds of network effects. There are certain kinds of industries that have that would be electricity. There are certain kinds of industries that have major externalities that can't easily be captured, like fossil fuels. And so we're willing to entertain like these liberal style of arguments for why we ought to think about them, but we don't tend to like say we're doing this in order to implement the workers' paradise because it's a matter of like changing the balance between like capital and labor and right, like that's, and I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it, that we're willing to approach topics that have been traditionally thought to be the preserve of the left or thought to be the preserve of the right, but to approach them from a liberal perspective.
Yeah. Though I will say, we have published people, and I think McManus is one of them who says things like this, that they publish people who believe in workplace democracy, for example, which I think is arguably specifically like socialist and leftist type framework and argument. Like that really is about like implementing democracy at the workplace because of its moral and egalitarian qualities, not the more liberal idea of I don't know, you make an argument. The consequentialist argument from liberalism would be something like it lines up incentives. It's good. It gives them an incentive to work harder or something. I don't know. You could make an argument like that. In any case, to your point, the kind of argument I would make for state control of some particular industry is different from the kind of argument that is made on behalf of workplace democracy. And we do publish people like that because, frankly, I find it unobjectionable. And also, the thing about like talking about a distinct liberal tradition or a distinct socialist tradition or even a Republican tradition, the civic republicanism or conservatism, is they're really just distinct if you do the work to make them distinct. They're all mutually influencing. Even as they're criticizing, well, especially because they're criticizing each other, probably they're mutually influencing each other. And some liberals take on some arguments from the other strains, and some people are just not cleanly one or the other, because we're all just people. We're not like you don't get sort of stamped liberal and you have to stay that way forever. Um, uh, so you know, liberals who use arguments from any other strain, there's plenty. We publish people like that. I'll just say.
Okay. So yeah, maybe maybe I should already know where the answer is coming from this, given what you said about the diversity of traditions in the liberal tradition, the many streams influencing each other. But what do you think defines liberalism as a
Yeah,
philosophy? What are its core values?
yeah. So our number one, still most read piece is the Principles of Liberalism piece that Paul Kreider wrote when we launched. Um, It's got strong Google juice. People Google principles of liberalism, it comes up and they go to it. Um, and at the time, so I'm going to just pull that up because I'm going to botch it. But there are a few things, right? So for one thing, liberalism is very much individualist, um, whereas socialism um, can focus on the benefits to individuals and often does, but it is more communitarian in its overall orientation. So, like workplace democracy is not really about the individual rights of workers necessarily. It is more about like the community of workers having control versus the community of capital. It's more, and the nation in socialism is much more straightforwardly a national community. Um, Obviously there's internationalist socialism too, but that then the communities become class communities internationally instead of national communities. Um, which is why, like, social democracy, even though liberal democracy and social democracy often empirically are basically identical in terms of you have a representative system, you have a welfare state, you have regulations, and you have some amount of state intervention in the economy beyond just regulations, or giving people money. Um, the sort of philosophy of social democracy is much more in the socialist tradition of it's a specifically country-based socialism that does care about having a democracy, unlike some strains of socialism in the 20th century, and unlike, it should be said, some strains of liberalism throughout history. The very early liberals did not necessarily care. Like a lot of the proto thinkers who didn't label as liberal, but were in the canon of works read by the first people who called themselves liberals, were not advocating democracy. People like Montesquieu, um, were very much okay with the monarchy as long as it was a decentralized, system where the locals could buttress against the monarch's power. Um, that was a bit rambly, but there are so individualism, liberalism is okay. Here we go. So Paul's list, which I think is a good place to start, is it's individualism and liberty. Um, and it's universalist, so it is not a particularist philosophy like conservatism. It's individualist, so it's not a communitarian philosophy like socialism. Um, and it also stands for equality of individuals, and pluralism. So it's liberalism fundamentally is about reconciling with social difference, um, and how you deal with that as well. So those are some of its basic characteristics. But within that, you can get a lot of different particulars, right?
Yeah, so that's an interesting list. It's interesting. It's real classic to put individualism as like the fundamental thing, right? We are concerned about the welfare or the rights or the that value inherently inheres in individuals and not classes, not
Well,
groups,
right.
not
So
nations, not communities, but people.
right. So I can stir up a little bit of controversy with an example,
Yeah,
uh,
go for it.
which is, personally, I care less about the Palestinian right to return than just that the Palestinian people get peace and prosperity if possible. Like, prosperity is not easy. Not everyone gets it, but I would like them to have it. I would like them to have
Mhm.
peace and prosperity, and frankly, a lot more freedom of movement than just a teeny tiny, you know, either Gaza or the West Bank. Like, I would like them to have much more freedom of movement and not be stateless. Also, so like that's part of freedom of movement is you have a state that actually has agreements with other countries that give you some measure of being able to at least visit there. So what I would like for them is essentially what's best for Palestinians as an individual, and the right of return thing, which is what they themselves, in many cases, and maybe in the overwhelmingly care about the most. I don't think matters morally, personally, and that's a very controversial statement, specifically to many of Liberal Currents readers and contributors, I would say, who are on the pro-Palestine side. But for me, the first order issue is making sure that individuals the Palestinians as individuals are taken care of and as free and prosperous and safe as possible.
Yeah, and I think this ties back to certain larger questions about nationalism, about how important it is to ensure that people wind up in like the right national community on the right land. And your perspective, I take it, is that it kind of doesn't matter. Right? Well, it can matter in very important practical
Yeah,
ways,
yeah,
but from a fundamental moral perspective, that's not the question.
right.
Um, I do kind of, before we spend the rest of this episode talking about Israel and Palestine, which I guess we could do, I want to ask about what you take to be some of the other elements of the liberal tradition. Because we talked about individualism versus collectivism. You said it was universalist versus particularist. Could you
Yeah,
elaborate on what that means?
yeah. So I mean, I guess this was Paul trying to straddle that rationalist and pluralist line. The universalist says, well, the best way to live is to be free. Like the best thing you can give people is effective freedom. And what that means, I mean, freedom is just a word, right? So it can mean a lot of things. Obviously, to libertarians, it mostly means property rights and low government intervention, but maybe like good, well enforced criminal laws against certain things. Um, to many 20th century liberals, it also means having a floor of prosperity, of actual economic strength, and ability to, not just freedom of movement formally, for example, but like having the means to actually travel if you need to, or pick up and move. Um, but your take on freedom is, universalism means you believe everyone deserves it, and maybe you think there are maybe, and then you can disagree on the practical paths to getting there. You could be actually a rationalist in the sense of we'll get there by having a strong central government that makes it law and enacts it, or maybe you think, well, since the strong national government itself could be a threat to that, I still am a universalist who believes everyone should have it, but let's try and work it through by persuading different political units at different levels. Um, and that way, if one of them goes bad, we're hedged, and the rest may stay good. But we all agree that everyone should have the good, which is freedom, even if we don't always get that everywhere. So that's the universalism aspect. Yeah.
Okay, and so I'm not going to ask you about pluralism. I think that's a little bit clear about what that means. What I'm struck by is that these are not really what people would normally pick as like the core principles of liberalism, right? People would say, well, it means you're a democracy. You have elections.
Right.
You guarantee such and such a list of basic rights. Maybe you have markets, free markets of some kind, and people would pick these much more substantive
Yeah.
policy questions, institutional design questions as definitive of liberalism. But you've stepped away from that. What's why?
Yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, in our new about section, democracy's in there, but no. But the reason we went with this more minimal list is precisely to do the mere liberalism thing. Um, now, we've argued from the beginning that you need democracy for this. Where if you want to talk, okay, here's, you asked earlier about examples of arguments that we would not publish. Someone saying that what you need is a dictator that will impose liberal values, we will not publish. I'm sorry, that's just, we're never going to do that. And that from the beginning, that was never going to be something we were going to publish. Um, and there are people who believe that. I mean, so Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, two libertarians, but I would say liberal libertarians, um, of the 20th century. One of their biggest black marks is they were sort of uh, gung ho on Pinochet when he came into power. And, I think they regretted that afterwards, perhaps. Um, but at first, I mean, Pinochet's brain trust was called the Chicago Boys, and that's because that's where they went to school. They learned from Friedman and such.
Well,
So
mater.
like so the idea was like, oh yeah, like we know what liberalism is. We've taught it to a group of elites, and now a dictator who has the power and the force of the state can just impose it without asking people if that's what they want. That's not that's not that's not something I'll ever publish or would ever defend. Um, that said, what we will publish are people who will defend strong judicial review, for example, which is not something I agree with, or several other people. But I mean, the Warren Court did make America a more liberal country institutionally. I think it's inarguable, and a lot of people like to give credit to the American people for valuing freedom of speech more than other places. But the fact of the matter is that the Supreme Court dismantled an absolute enormous body of state and local laws, that highly regulated speech, in the second half of the 20th century. I mean, like 70s and 80s, late. What we think of as the First Amendment, just like, oh, it's just in the Constitution, it's just the First Amendment. Somewhere, like I remember someone saying to me once, well, in France, like they just don't have a First Amendment, and that's why they do X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, no, it's not because we have a First Amendment. It's because we had a specific couple of Supreme Courts that were very aggressive about crushing any kind of speech um, regulation and set precedents that have more or less been honored by even the current court for the most part. Um, so, a liberal that wants to say you need strong judicial review to actually enforce rights because legislatures and executives, whether they're presidential, governor, mayor, or parliamentary, um, people will say they're for free speech, but they're also against certain kinds of speech, and they're not philosophers. They don't necessarily think through that that's a contradiction or care, perhaps. And elected governments will enact that stuff all the time. But if you put in a constitution that the free speech is a right, you have a process for amending, and you have a judiciary that will actually enforce that right. That's good. I will publish people like that. And I think that's actually a proposition that is worth debating because I think that is an important tension. I am a legislative supremacist, 100%. Um, but I think it's important to note that the Supreme Court in the civil rights movement did play an important role. Most people understand that. I think less important than people realize. But it did a lot of smaller things. Like people think of Brown, but for example, one thing that the Supreme Court did is it outlawed whites only primaries in the South when the South was just a one party system, and that actually and resulted in a bump up in black enfranchisement, which doesn't get discussed except by historians and things. Most people aren't aware of it, but there were little things like that they did that made the later victories a little easier. So that's something that I think is very worth having a conversation about.
Okay. So I guess my next question kind of brings us back to where we started, which is the way people use liberal as a pejorative,
Yeah,
right? They say, "Oh, that's a liberal idea," and I recently read a book, Amia Srinivasan's *The Right to Sex*, and one of the really interesting things to me in it is the way that, like, occasionally she'll just say, like, "This is a liberal idea, and therefore it's wrong." Um, no, I mean, she doesn't define what liberal is, blah blah blah, and that's what we call like high church philosophy. She's a professor of philosophy. She's a feminist, but this is also something you see everywhere on the internet because, like, oh,
yeah.
those are like the libs, right? The libs are once again, showing their true colors and having no principles and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Um, what do you think about that discourse?
I mean, I will be fair. It's similar to how American conservatives will call fairly ordinary um, liberal democratic welfare and regulatory state stuff socialism as a pejorative when it's not socialism particularly. Um, uh, there's always sort of any kind of ideological or political label becomes a pejorative at some point. And, you know, there's prominent people in the press who are definitely liberals, but kind of suck in a number of ways. They haven't risen to our moment, or they are actually weak on the trans question, or they're pro Ukraine, but like pretty much think that you're anti-Semitic if you criticize Israel for anything at all. Like there are actual people who are liberals in public life that are part of the reputation of liberalism as a politically existing thing in reality. And that's part of the pejorative. The other part of it is just differentiation, right? Like that's just the nature of differentiation. The author you were just talking about, like she doesn't want to be seen as a liberal by her peers, so she has to frequently invoke that they suck. Like that's just like it's just something you have to do. Like okay, and especially in her case, right? Because that book, The Right to Sex, is drawing out a lot of tensions within feminism, right? Among a lot of people that are part of her community. And one way you make people receptive to the idea that there are problems that need to be addressed in your shared ideology is continually comforting them that it is a shared ideology. You are on their side. And one way you do that is finding another group that you all hate to kick. Um, I mean, it's just a classic rhetorical move, right?
I mean, when you put it that way, yeah, I mean that does actually make a lot of sense in this particular case. I guess I kind of want to push back a little bit, and to me, it's more than just differentiation. It's more than just oh, everybody says they hate libs as a way of proving that they're cooler or whatever. Um, but there's something you said at the outset that that you founded liberal currents because you felt like liberalism had become a dead letter, right? Everybody, made their obeisances to the liberal bromides, but no one believed in them anymore, that they weren't a live tradition. And when I look out at the world, I mean, I see that. I see people who would call themselves liberals or think of themselves as liberals, but they don't have, you know, like the liberal project as a vital political philosophy seems absent in them, right? And there are ways that they've just kind of accreted all these ideas. Like, for example, like you were saying, their position on Israel and Palestine, that's not derived from what you would call a liberal philosophy, but just like, America's Cold War geopolitical position. And then they just added that on to like what they take to be the standard list of like liberal ideas. Um, right. And so to me, I think this is a real problem.
Yeah,
Um,
agree.
I think whatever, Francis Fukuyama and the end of history, which is, I think, these days is more maligned than it ought to be, kind of signaled like, yeah, liberalism, this was his big bet in the end of history, was that liberalism had beat out its major 20th century ideological competitors, and that after that, people would forget about what made liberalism different, that they would forget about it as a tradition, and we might wind up refighting some of these battles. I mean, what do you think about that analysis?
Yeah, so people mistakenly think that John Stuart Mill believed that if you have a free marketplace of ideas, the best ideas will triumph. He never said that. But one thing he did say that has stuck with me that I think is very good is that you have hypotheses or arguments that are either live or not. Um, and like once they become accepted and enough time goes by, they stop being live and they just sort of sink to the level of basic assumption. But at that point, there's a real danger because everyone will forget why they won the argument in the first place if they did. So even if they won for the right reasons, which that's not always the case, but even if there were merits and there were good reasons why it became the prevailing point of view, it would given enough time, people will forget. And it's not a literal forgetting, right? It's more um, one generation had this argument and is very familiar with it. Um, but then the next generation just learns the conclusion of the argument, which was who turned out to be who won the day. It gets taught more as values than as an argument, with some basic like rationales that, like you said, are more bromides than an actual argument. And then from there, it just sinks even deeper into just the level of assumptions and rhetoric. Um, so that when a real challenge comes along again, people can be vulnerable. And one way that I saw this happen in the libertarian community that is still very pervasive and that we're very much living with today, as we just published a piece today, for example, by Chance Phillips on the white supremacists of the Trump administration. But to me, that all goes back to the Charles Murray race and IQ, race realist, as they call it, idea, which was essentially that like liberals have no argument against the idea that there's biological inferiority among some races versus others. And the only reason that the view doesn't triumph is because of pure appeal to authority. So the authority of liberalism and the ideals of egalitarianism, that people should be equal, um, means that you're not allowed to talk about the reality of racial difference. And because people encountered that way, um, because their own idea of equality was just sort of like at the level of assumptions and bromides, whereas the race and IQ people were like, well, look, there's this Charles Murray guy. He's got all this data. Like, Like do your own research. It feels like there's more of an argument to those people that to the the racist side, than there was to the egalitarian side, which is just, what the hell are you talking about? People are just people, right? And that just sounds pithy, but not like an argument. Of course, there are, obviously, Murray has been criticized since the very beginning by actual social scientists and statisticians and geneticists and biologists and things like that. Um, but they never made as big a splash as he did in the actual public discussion. Um, so it's difficult, and that becomes kind of like a cancer that I saw eat the libertarian community in from the inside. Like, I went to GMU Econ. That's where I was exposed to libertarianism, and they were already super into that stuff. Brian Kaplan taught people in his labor economics class. I didn't take this class; I just heard it from another student. But in his labor economics class for undergraduates, he had people read the bell curve. Um, and Robin Hanson, big racing IQ guy. Garrett Jones, his research is on national average IQs. Like, there's just it's huge there, and it just spread further to the point where you get now people like the ones that Chance covered today, who just say things like, we're not, what America needs is competent white men running the country. Like, that's just obvious, but you're not allowed to say that. Like, that's that's their, now that's reached the level of just assumption among a large segment of that community.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that gets back to, what my recent conversation with Aaron Ross Powell about, like, the dirty marriage the libertarian movement made with the right, and
Yeah.
how it turned out that the right influenced them far more than they ever influenced the right,
Oh
at
yeah.
least in his telling.
Absolutely.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I think to me, this gets to, again, why people have a hard time categorizing us. Like you gave as the example, well, we've been very pro Ukraine, we've been pro Palestinian rights, and we've also been pro trans. And also, we run pieces about how you need like a freer market in housing. Um, right. And like those four positions together, like people find very confusing sometimes. Um, right. They're like, they can't figure out like which side of some, contemporary political fight to put us on. Um, but I think for me, this is like one of the ways that I like to describe what we're trying to do at Liberal Currents is, we're trying to be liberals who mean it,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
right? To not just say, well, of course we have to support this position because, like, that's like where we found ourselves in this weird, contemporary American political debate, but going back to these basic liberal principles, right? About human freedom, about the importance of individual freedom, anywhere in the world, regardless of, the color of your skin or which flag is waving over your head or any of that, and saying, okay, well, what do liberal principles tell us about this situation? Right? If we thought about this from a perspective of universal human liberty, what would it tell us about this situation? And so to me, that's one of the defining features of what we've been trying to do
Yeah. I agree.
here. Okay. Uh, Okay, so I guess turning away from some of this more philosophical stuff, um, one last question, one last topic I want to ask you about is what do you see the role of liberal currents as in our contemporary political situation?
Yeah. I mean, I would like us to be a large opposition press, but I think long philosophical essays are difficult to get into that position. We're certainly a much larger one than we were 6 months ago. Um, but given our particular size, I would say currently we are a place for um, some people to understand what a fighting liberalism looks like in our specific situation with the Trump administration. Um, and that means, I mean, we had already moved away from just too abstract philosophical theorizing for the most part being our main product. Um, but this year we've written a bunch of things that are just like, I wrote one quick one that was essentially state bars could make a statement saying that they will disbar any lawyer whose firm caves to the Trump administration. That's a very like almost, I don't even know what you would call it. That's not even political commentary. That's almost at the level of just activism of saying like, let's do a pressure campaign on state, but we need to stop these law firms from caving because it's going to cascade, and we'll lose rule of law. So one lever for doing that is state bars disbarring, saying maybe you'll be in trouble with the Trump administration if you don't cave, but you'll definitely lose your ability to practice law if you do. And then what are you protecting by caving, really? That's one lever. Obviously, it wasn't going to happen, but I feel that part of our role is actually saying, hey, there are levers, and here they are, and community, because our readership is disproportionately educated people like lawyers who could take that information and go to their state legal community of which they are participants, as part of a talking point. So arming people with concrete ideas like that, then arming at a level up, arming people with um, the knowledge of understanding what is actually happening. Because one of the things that bothered me the first couple of years we had Liberal Currents is that my own feeling that I wasn't actually sure which Trump administration actions were actually unprecedented and which were fairly within the continuity of how, unfortunately, presidents overreach regularly in our system. And it took some time, invested in learning to know that. So I would like to reduce the amount of time that takes for other people by publishing things that actually help them to understand. Listen, this is bad, but it's a long-term bad, and this is actually, way beyond the pale. Unfortunately, in the first 6 months, I would say we've had probably more in the first 6 months than in the first 3 years of the first Trump term. Even though there was plenty in the first Trump term, it's just been so much. So it's not like we have a shortage of that. But in many ways, that makes it even more valuable, because a lot gets missed, because so much is happening.
Yeah, so that's interesting to me because I mean we still do publish philosophical stuff, right? We
Yeah.
recently published two articles from Matt McManus that are like his reading of the reactionary canon.
Yes.
Right, here are 10 dead philosophers who wrote about, who wrote from the perspective of reaction. Here are five or seven living philosophers who are writing about reactionary themes. Right, I've written stuff that the new gender synthesis, that is like a
Right.
pretty abstract essay about like gender and the future of gender, and these do pretty well,
Yeah.
right?
They
But
do.
we also
They do.
publish the stuff that you're talking about, right? Stuff
Yeah.
that is like this is what's happening in the treasury payments system, right? This is what Elon Musk is doing to the American university system, right? This Chance Phillips essay that we just had about the explosion of just out and out racists and white super, like, not people who are just like a little bit racist, but like white nationalists as a political project. What they are here to do is pursue white nationalism,
Yeah.
who are staffed all over the White House, all over the executive agencies at this point. Right. So I'm curious what you want to say about that balance of like
Yeah.
more philosophical stuff versus like more resist lib stuff.
I will say that we wanted to do pretty much all of it from the beginning, and that part of what has changed, not just the fact that the Trump administration is so like 100 times as insane now, but is just our network and our skill set. When we were preparing to launch Liberal Currents, I emailed tons of local ACLU chapters, just sort of like cold emailed them, and were like, hey, you guys have the knowledge of some sort of the more concrete particulars. We're looking to find young liberals and help get them started writing in public. Can we connect with people? That really didn't go anywhere. A few places were sort of interested, but at first I had a very brute force approach to just sort of cold emailing people who I did not know, to try and get them. Now we're known enough that people with that know-how will come to us, or if I ask, they say yes, because they know who I am. Um, uh, like when you had Anna Law on, for example, too. People like that just didn't know we existed and weren't going to say yes to a random new publication in 2017, 2018. Um, so part of it is our skill set and our talent pool and network have expanded enough where we can do that. And we always wanted to have a balance of each. Um, and part of it is, of course, the emergency that's happening right now, and that's skewed it more towards that. But in general, I think it's important to have all of it. And in fact, when I was saying we write things that help people understand the moment, the state bar thing is a very concrete end of that. But I think your gender essay is actually still within that field on the abstract side of it, but it's still about understanding our moment. When you talk about the weird gender performances of the people on the right, it's not this isn't just about like this isn't a philosophical treaty. It is really about trying to understand our moment. Same with your like long 90s piece, for example. Those are semi-abstract because they're not really about policy or specific events. And they are about understanding, but they're about understanding our moment and here and now. Um, and I think that in particular is very important. But we also do, as you said, we publish the Matt McManus political theory stuff. Occasionally, I dabble in that myself too. Like last year, I wrote an essay about the Open Society um, uh, as a concept. Um, that's still important. I think it's all. I also wrote last year. I think sort of the actual taxonomy of different kinds of writing that you can do that will be useful for different reasons.
So I wanted to ask you about that specifically, actually, because one thing you'll hear on the internet a lot is, oh, well, posting isn't praxis, right? Online isn't
Yeah.
reality. So, like, what role do you see, like, writing at all, this publication at all, as having in our politics today?
Yeah. I mean, if um, again, if on the concrete side, if people pick up some of those actual to dos and help pursue them, that is one palpable benefit. Um, on the middle one, which is more like your gender essay, um, uh, if people start taking that kind of problem more seriously and start thinking about the more particular solutions themselves, that is also, I think, a win. There's a strategic advantage too, right? If we're writing about the overall, even like Steve Randy Waldman talking about trade, if you're thinking about what does a ideal democratic trifecta do, even if we don't give you the practical program, starting from here is a good framework for understanding the reality on the ground that they're going to face, is valuable, and we probably provide more of that than any of the others, right? That middle ground is probably the one we do the most of, I would say. And like you said, it's pretty the widest read stuff is in that area. Um, and then on the more abstract side, it is, well, why do we care about this? And what are we even fighting for? Um, what are the ideas that animate our enemies? Not just ourselves. And why is it not? Why is it illiberal? Why is it actually not compatible with our point of view? Um, so it's the whole spectrum. Like I said, the middle part is what we mostly have the greatest strengths in, which is sort of applying the philosophy as a lens to understanding the near term, like if maybe not necessarily like today, but like the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, to understand the landscape. But then also more and more, just here's some tools. Like one of our one the probably the I think the most read thing I have ever written was written a day or two after the election. And it was literally just here is every sort of institutional tool that is available to sandbag the federal government for the next 4 years, and why we need to focus specifically on pressuring elites that are against Trump, Democrats mostly, but also bureaucrats and others to make use of those tools in that way.
Yeah, I mean, there's this great quote from Keynes, right? Madmen who distill voices from the air are actually just copying the words of some academic scribbler from a generation ago. And I think that's true. In the general sense, I've written about this in 2 essays. Why movements fail and how movements succeed. That I think elite persuasion matters. Winning the ideological war at the elite level matters a lot, because the popular mobilization, the mass swell of people in the street matters, and it can matter an enormous amount, but that kind of energy can be undirected. And in many cases across history, you have this enormous outpouring of energy, and then it finds its way towards a certain outcome that is often inflected by what set of ideas are on the bookshelf when people go looking for, well, what do we do? What do we do in this moment of crisis? And they look for a portfolio of ideas that's already there. And so to me, anyways, I think that's one of the valuable things that we try to do here.
Yeah,
right? To
absolutely.
try to put together that portfolio of ideas, to try to take ideas that are in the academy or in intellectual circles and push them out to, like you say, to a wider audience. And that's slow work, right? Without a lot of clear victories, but when it matters, it matters.
Yeah,
And so that's how I tend to see what we're doing here.
absolutely.
Okay, so we're just about at an hour. You have any last words for all the liberals in the audience?
Pitch us. Pitch us at writers at liberalcurrents.com. We're always looking to bring in people. One of the greatest joys I've had is watching people that started with us sort of rise. The first year we started paying people back in 2020, there was a young woman who we were her first place she got published at, and by the end of the year we couldn't afford her. She was getting published at better places. So it was, that was a dramatic example, but um, I always love to see that. Another part of the project I think we didn't mention as much is being a home for young people to feel like liberalism is not a dead end. That it actually is exciting and a place to where you and a tradition that you can stand from to fight against things like the Trump administration.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to second that. You should absolutely pitch us. We are always looking out for young, interesting, bold liberal thought. So yeah, writers at liberalcurrents.com. You know where to find us.